The dust devil that kicked up between Mason Hart's boots that morning in July 1882 should have been his first warning that the day would bring something different. But he rode on through the Arizona heat anyway, his horse barely lifting its hooves as they made their way down the road from Wilcox toward his small homestead. What he found sprawled beneath a dying mesquite tree would change everything he thought he knew about loneliness and love. Two young women, their dresses torn and faces hollow with hunger, lay unconscious in the dirt like broken dolls someone had tossed aside without care. Mason swung down from his horse before the animal even stopped moving, his heart hammering against his ribs as he dropped to his knees beside them. The first girl, maybe 19 or 20, had dark blonde hair matted with dust and blood from a cut on her forehead. The second, slightly younger with the same fine features, breathed so shallow he had to press his fingers to her throat to feel the pulse fluttering there like a trapped bird. They were sisters. That much was clear from the identical shape of their noses and the similar curve of their chins. Their lips were cracked and bleeding, their skin burned red from the merciless sun. He pulled his canteen from his saddle and wet his bandana, pressing it gently to the older girl's lips. She stirred, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal eyes the color of wildflowers after rain. She tried to speak, but only managed a croak that sounded more animal than human. Mason held the canteen to her mouth, letting just a few drops trickle past her lips. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough from his own day without much conversation or water. "Just a little at a time or you will be sick." The girl's eyes focused on him with desperate gratitude before sliding to her sister. "Willa," she whispered, the name barely audible. "My sister." "I have got her too," Mason assured her, already moving to tend to the younger girl. "What are your names? What happened to you?" "Wendy," the older sister managed. "Wendy Lewis. We have been walking for 3 days. Our wagon train left us when Papa died of fever. They took everything, even our water." Her voice broke on the last word, and tears made clean tracks through the dirt on her face. Mason felt fury rise hot in his chest at the cruelty of people who would abandon 2 young women in the desert, but he pushed it down to focus on what mattered now, getting them somewhere safe. Getting them fed and watered and out of this killing heat. His homestead was only 2 miles away, but with both girls barely conscious, it might as well have been 20. He got Willa to rouse enough to take some water, and she clung to his arm with surprising strength for someone so depleted. Her eyes, the same impossible blue as her sister's, fixed on his face with a mixture of fear and hope that made something twist painfully in his chest. She was younger than Wendy, maybe 18, with hair a shade lighter and features that held an almost ethereal delicacy. Even starved and sunburned, she was beautiful in a way that made Mason forget for a moment how to breathe properly. "Can you sit up?" he asked Wendy first, helping her into a sitting position when she nodded. The world spun around her. He could see it in how her eyes lost focus, but she stayed upright through sheer determination. He helped Willa next, and then faced the problem of getting 2 half-conscious young women and himself back to his place on one horse. The animal, a sturdy buckskin mare named Sage, stood patient as Mason lifted Wendy into the saddle first. She swayed dangerously, so he mounted behind her, pulling her back against his chest to keep her steady. Then he reached down for Willa, hauling her up to sit sideways in front of him. She was light as a child in his arms, all sharp bones and fevered skin, and he kicked Sage into the gentlest walk the mare could manage. The 2 miles took an eternity. Wendy drifted in and out of consciousness against his shoulder, while Willa trembled in his arms, occasionally whimpering with pain or confusion. Mason talked to them the whole way, keeping his voice low and steady, telling them about his homestead, and how he had built it with his own 2 hands after mustering out of the cavalry 3 years back. He told them about the small vegetable garden he was trying to coax into existence despite the harsh climate, and about Sage, who was the smartest horse he had ever known. He told them they were safe now, and he would take care of them, even though he had no idea how he was going to manage that with supplies already running dangerously low. His cabin appeared like a mirage in the wavering heat, small and weathered but solid, with a lean-to stable and a chicken coop that currently housed exactly 3 hens. Mason had been planning to ride into Wilcox tomorrow to see about work, because his money was almost gone, and he had maybe enough food left for another week if he was careful. Now he had 2 more mouths to feed, and no time to figure out the logistics before he had to get these girls inside and out of the brutal afternoon sun. He dismounted awkwardly with Willa still in his arms and carried her straight into the cabin, laying her on his bed. The single room was sparse but clean, with a table, 2 chairs, a stove, and the bed taking up most of the space. He went back for Wendy, who managed to walk with his support, her arm around his waist and his around her shoulders. She sank onto the bed next to her sister with a sob of relief. Mason filled a basin with water from his barrel and grabbed the cleanest cloth he owned, then knelt beside the bed to start washing the dirt and blood from their faces and hands. Wendy watched him with those extraordinary eyes, and he found himself unable to look away even as he tended to the cut on her forehead. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought we were going to die out there. I prayed for someone to find us, and then you came." "I am glad I was riding this road today," Mason said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. His hands were gentle as he cleaned the wound, and when Wendy winced, he murmured an apology that came out more tender than he intended. Willa stirred, reaching for her sister's hand. "Wendy." "Are we safe?" "We are safe," Wendy assured her, squeezing her fingers. "This man, he saved us." "Mason," he supplied. "Mason Hart. And you are at my home, such as it is. Not much to look at, but it has walls and a roof, and you can rest here as long as you need." He moved to check Willa's injuries next, finding her in better shape than her sister, but still far too thin and dehydrated. As he worked, he became acutely aware of how young and vulnerable they were, how much trust they were placing in a stranger. The responsibility of it settled over his shoulders like a physical weight. He was 26 years old, had survived the cavalry and hostile territory, and had built a life from nothing in this harsh land. But he had never felt as unprepared for something as he did for this. When both sisters were as clean and comfortable as he could make them, Mason turned to the problem of food. He went to his small pantry and took stock of what he had left. Some cornmeal, a handful of beans, 3 potatoes, a little bacon, some coffee, and a half loaf of bread that was going stale. It was meant to last him until he could get into town and earn some money, but these girls needed food now. They needed something in their stomachs, or they would not make it through the night. He made his decision quickly, the way he had learned to do in the cavalry when hesitation could get you killed. He would make them everything he had. Beans and bacon and potatoes cooked together into a stew that would stick to their ribs. The bread toasted by the fire. Coffee with the last of his sugar to give them something sweet. It was his last real meal, but that did not matter. He could go hungry. He had done it before during the war. But these girls had already been without food for 3 days, and he could not, would not, let them suffer any longer. He set to work at the stove, stoking the fire and getting water boiling. The beans needed to soak, but he did not have time for that, so he just cooked them longer, checking on the sisters every few minutes as they dozed fitfully on his bed. The cabin filled with the smell of cooking food, and he saw both girls stir at the scent. their bodies responding even in sleep to the promise of sustenance. While the stew simmered, Mason went outside to tend to Sage and check on his chickens. The hens had laid 2 eggs, which he collected carefully and brought back inside. He would scramble those for the girls too, give them the protein they desperately needed. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him that he had not eaten since a small breakfast of coffee and a piece of the bread, but he ignored it. This was the right thing to do, the only thing to do. When the food was ready, he helped both sisters sit up, propping them against the wall with his spare blankets behind their backs. Their eyes went wide at the sight of the bowls he handed them, filled with steaming stew and a thick slice of toasted bread on the side. He had scrambled the eggs with a little of the bacon fat and divided that between them too. "This is too much," Wendy protested, even as her hands shook with the need to eat. "You need to eat too." "I already did," Mason lied easily. "This is for you. Go on now, but eat slow. Your stomachs will not be used to food after going without." He did not have to tell them twice. Both sisters ate with a desperation that was painful to watch, trying to go slow like he had instructed, but unable to help themselves from shoveling the food in as fast as they could swallow. He sat at the table with a cup of coffee, the only thing he allowed himself, and watched them with a mixture of satisfaction and worry. They needed so much more than one meal. They needed weeks of good food and rest and safety. They needed new clothes and medicine for their burns and 100 other things he could not provide. But he would figure it out. Somehow, he would take care of them. The alternative was unthinkable now that he had pulled them from the desert and heard Wendy's voice saying his name like a prayer of thanks. When both bowls were empty and scraped clean, the sisters leaned back with matching expressions of relief. Color had returned to their faces, just a little, enough to make them look less like ghosts. Wendy met Mason's eyes across the small room, and something passed between them, some wordless understanding that made his heart beat faster. "That was the best thing I have ever eaten," Willa said softly. "I cannot believe you gave us so much. You barely know us." "You needed it," Mason said simply. "Could not let you go hungry when I had food to share." "Was that really your last meal?" Wendy asked, her eyes too knowing. "I saw your pantry when you opened it. There is almost nothing left." Mason shifted uncomfortably, not wanting to lie to her but not wanting her to feel guilty either. "I will manage. I was planning to go into Wilcox anyway, see about some work. I will do that tomorrow and we will be fine." "We cannot ask you to do that," Wendy said, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "You have already done more than we could ever repay. If you can take us to town tomorrow, we will figure something out. We can work too. We are not helpless." "I did not say you were helpless," Mason replied. "But you are in no shape to work right now. You need rest. A few days at least." "We do not have a few days of supplies," Wendy pointed out, and Mason appreciated that she was being practical even in a situation like this. "And we cannot expect you to starve for strangers." "You are not strangers anymore," Mason said, and was surprised to find he meant it. In the few hours since he had found them, these sisters had somehow become important to him in a way he could not quite explain. "You are guests in my home, and where I come from, you take care of your guests." Willa smiled at that, a real smile that transformed her whole face despite the cracked lips and sunburn. "Where do you come from, Mason Hart?" "Missouri," he said. "Little town called Independence. Grew up on a farm, joined the cavalry when I was 18, mustered out 3 years ago and drifted west until I found a piece of land here that spoke to me. Been trying to make it work ever since." "It is beautiful country," Wendy said. "Harsh but beautiful. I can see why you stayed." They talked as the evening light turned golden through the single window, and Mason learned that the sisters were from Ohio originally. Their mother had died when they were young, and their father had decided to start over in California, joining a wagon train in Santa Fe. But he had fallen ill with fever shortly after they entered Arizona, and when he died, the wagon master had declared that the sisters were bad luck and put them off the train with barely any supplies. They had walked for 3 days in the desert heat, rationing the single canteen of water they had been given, until that ran out too. They had laid down under that mesquite tree to die, and then Mason had found them. The cruelty of it made Mason's blood boil, but he kept his voice even as he assured them that they were safe now and would not have to face anything like that again. As darkness fell, he lit his 2 lanterns and laid out his bedroll on the floor near the stove. "You take the bed," he told the sisters when they protested. "I have slept in worse places, believe me. You need a proper rest." He turned his back to give them privacy as they settled in and heard the whispered conversation between them. He caught his name once, and Wendy's voice saying something he could not quite make out. Then Willa's soft laugh, the first genuine sound of happiness he had heard from either of them. Sleep did not come easy for Mason that night. His stomach cramped with hunger, but more than that, his mind would not stop racing. He kept thinking about Wendy's eyes, the way she had looked at him with such gratitude and trust. He kept thinking about how light Willa had been in his arms, how fragile they both seemed. He kept thinking about the fact that he had maybe half a pot of coffee left and nothing else, and 2 young women depending on him to figure out how to get more. When morning came, pale and already promising heat, Mason rose quietly and stepped outside to give the sisters privacy to wake and dress. He fed Sage the last of the oats and checked the water barrel, which was getting low. Another thing to deal with. The list of problems was growing faster than his ability to solve them, but he pushed the worry down and focused on what he could control. The door creaked open behind him and Wendy emerged into the early light. She had braided her hair and washed her face again, and even in her torn and dusty dress, she was striking. The sunburn on her face had faded a little overnight, and her eyes were clearer, more alert. She walked over to where he stood by the corral fence and leaned against the rough wood beside him. "You did not eat anything last night," she said without preamble, "and I would bet you did not have anything this morning either." "I am fine," Mason said. "You are a terrible liar," Wendy replied, but there was affection in her voice. "Mason, you gave us everything. Your food, your bed, your safety. That is more kindness than we have known in months, maybe years, but you cannot take care of us if you are starving yourself." "I will get work today," Mason promised. "There is always something that needs doing in Wilcox, someone who needs a hand with horses or cattle or building. I am good with my hands and people know I do honest work." "Then let us come with you," Wendy said. "We can help. We can work too. I can cook clean so. Willa is good with numbers and rating. We can earn our keep." Mason wanted to argue to tell her she needed more rest, but he saw the determination in her face and knew it would be pointless. Besides, she was right. They could not stay at his homestead with no food and no prospects. They needed to go to town together and figure something out. "All right," he agreed. "But you tell me if either of you gets tired or feels poorly. We will rest as much as you need." Wendy nodded, and then she did something that caught Mason completely off guard. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers slim and cool in his rough palm. She squeezed once, gently, and looked up at him with those impossible blue eyes. "Thank you, Mason," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything. For saving us. For feeding us. For treating us with respect and kindness when you had every right to just keep riding. I will never forget what you did for us yesterday." Mason found he could not speak past the sudden tightness in his throat, so he just squeezed her hand back and nodded. They stood there for a moment in the golden morning light, hands clasped, and Mason felt something shift inside him. Something that had been closed off since the war, since watching too many friends die for causes that seemed less and less clear as time went on. Something that felt dangerously like hope. The ride into Wilcox took most of the morning, with all three of them crowded onto Sage again. Mason insisted the sisters share the saddle while he walked alongside, leading the mare. It was slower going but easier on everyone, and it gave him time to think about what they would do once they reached town. Wilcox was small but growing, with false-fronted buildings lining a wide dirt street and enough people moving about to suggest business was good. The general store sat next to a boarding house, which was next to a saloon, which was next to a land office. There was a church at one end of town and a livery at the other. Mason tied Sage outside the boarding house and helped both sisters down from the saddle. "Wait here," he told them. "I am going to see about getting you ladies a proper room for a few nights while we figure things out." "We have no money," Wendy reminded him, but Mason waved her off. "I will work it out with Mrs. Patterson, who runs the place. She is decent folk." Inside the boarding house, Mason found Mrs. Patterson sweeping the entryway. She was a stout woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a kind heart, and she listened without interrupting as Mason explained the situation. When he finished, she set her broom aside and nodded briskly. "Those poor girls," she said. "What kind of monsters leave young women alone in the desert?" "You bring them in, Mr. Hart. I've got a room they can use, and they can earn their keep helping me around here until they get their feet under them. Lord knows I could use the help with the washing and cooking." Relief flooded through Mason so intensely he felt dizzy with it. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. I will work off their room and board if you need." "You will do no such thing," she said firmly. "You saved those girls. You fed them your last meal, if I know you at all. The least I can do is give them a place to stay. Now go get them and bring them inside. They look like they need a hot bath and some proper rest." Mason brought Wendy and Willa inside and introduced them to Mrs. Patterson, who clucked over them like a mother hen and immediately started issuing orders about baths and food and rest. The sisters looked overwhelmed but grateful, and Wendy caught Mason's arm as Mrs. Patterson bustled off to prepare the room. "You arranged this," she said. "How are we supposed to pay for it?" "You will work for your keep," Mason explained. "Mrs. Patterson needs help and you need a place to stay. It works out for everyone." "And what about you?" Wendy asked, her eyes searching his face. "What will you do?" "I am going to see about work," Mason said. "Get some money together so I can buy supplies. Do not worry about me. Just rest and get your strength back." He started to turn away, but Wendy's hand on his arm stopped him. "Will you come back to see us?" There was something vulnerable in the question, something that made Mason's heart clench. "Of course," he said. "I will check on you both tonight if Mrs. Patterson allows it." "She better allow it," Wendy said with a small smile, "or I will convince her." Mason left the boarding house with a lighter step than he had arrived, his immediate worry about the sisters' welfare eased. Now he needed to focus on earning money. He headed to the livery first, where he knew the owner, a gruff man named Tom Bailey who was always looking for help with the horses. Tom hired him on the spot to help break a new string of horses that had come in from a ranch south of town. The work was hard and dangerous, exactly the kind of thing Mason was good at from his cavalry days. Tom offered him $2 a day plus meals, which was generous, and Mason accepted gratefully. He spent the rest of the day in the corral, working with the half-wild horses, talking to them in the low voice that always seemed to calm even the most skittish animals. By evening, his body ached and his hands were raw, but he had earned his first day's pay and a solid meal from Tom's wife. He washed up at the pump behind the livery and walked back toward the boarding house as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold. His stomach was full for the first time in 2 days, and he had the promise of more work tomorrow. Things were looking up. Mrs. Patterson let him in with a knowing smile and directed him to the small parlor where Wendy and Willa sat on a worn sofa. Both sisters looked transformed from this morning. They were clean, their hair washed and shining, wearing dresses that Mrs. Patterson had loaned them. The sunburn on their faces was fading, and they had the look of young women who had been well fed and rested. Wendy stood when she saw him, her face lighting up in a way that made Mason's breath catch. "You came," she said, as if she had doubted it. "I said I would," Mason replied. He nodded to Willa, who smiled shyly at him from the sofa. "How are you both feeling?" "Like human beings again," Willa said. "Mrs. Patterson has been so kind. She fed us soup and bread, and we had baths with real hot water. I feel like I could sleep for a week." "Then you should," Mason said. "Sleep as much as you need." "What about you?" Wendy asked, moving closer to him. "Did you find work?" "I did," Mason confirmed. "At the livery, breaking horses. It will keep me busy and earning for a while." "That is dangerous work," Wendy said, and Mason heard the worry in her voice. "I know what I am doing," he assured her. "I did it in the cavalry for years. The horses and I understand each other." They talked for a while in the soft lamplight, the three of them finding an easy rhythm of conversation that felt natural despite how recently they had met. Willa told stories about their childhood in Ohio, about their mother who had loved to garden and their father who had dreamed of California gold. Wendy talked about the journey west, the good parts before everything went wrong. Mason found himself sharing stories from his cavalry days, the funny ones that did not involve death or violence, and was rewarded with their laughter. When Mrs. Patterson appeared to tell the sisters it was time for bed, Mason rose to leave. Wendy walked him to the door, and they stood in the entryway for a moment, neither quite ready to say good night. "Thank you again," Wendy said softly, "for everything, for not giving up on us." "I could never give up on you," Mason said, and then felt heat rise in his face at how that sounded. "I mean on both of you. I could not give up on either of you." Wendy's smile was gentle and knowing. "I know what you meant, Mason Hart, and I am glad, because I do not think I could stand it if you disappeared from our lives now." She leaned up and kissed his cheek, her lips soft and warm against his skin. Then she stepped back, her eyes holding his for a long moment before she turned and went back inside. Mason walked back to the livery in a daze, his hand touching the place where she had kissed him, his heart doing strange things in his chest. He spent that night in the livery's loft, Tom having offered him a place to sleep for free in exchange for keeping an eye on the horses. It was not much, just a bedroll in the hay, but it was better than riding back to his empty homestead, and it meant he could start work early in the morning. As he lay in the darkness listening to the horses move in their stalls below, Mason thought about Wendy's eyes and Willa's shy smile, and the way they both trusted him so completely. He thought about how empty his life had felt before yesterday, and how full it seemed now even though he had less materially than he had before. The next few weeks fell into a pattern. Mason worked at the livery from dawn to dusk, breaking horses and repairing tack and doing whatever Tom needed. The sisters worked at the boarding house, helping Mrs. Patterson with cooking and cleaning and tending to the guests. Every evening, Mason would wash up and go to the boarding house, where Wendy and Willa would be waiting for him. They would sit in the parlor or, when the weather was nice, on the porch, and talk until Mrs. Patterson chased them all off to bed. Slowly, Mason began to notice how his heart lifted every time he saw Wendy, how his whole day felt brighter knowing he would see her that evening. He noticed how her eyes sought him out in a crowded room, how she laughed at his jokes even when they were not particularly funny, how she found excuses to touch his arm or his hand. He noticed how Willa would make herself scarce sometimes, leaving them alone on the porch, and how Wendy would blush when that happened but never move away from where she sat close beside him. One night, about a month after he had found them, Mason and Wendy sat on the porch while Willa helped Mrs. Patterson with something inside. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light over the quiet street. Wendy leaned against the porch railing, her face turned up to the sky, and Mason could not stop looking at her. She had gained back the weight she had lost, and her skin was clear and healthy now, glowing in the moonlight. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "What are you thinking about?" Wendy asked, catching him staring. "You," Mason said honestly, past the point of hiding it. Wendy turned to face him fully, her eyes wide and dark in the dim light. "What about me?" Mason took a breath, gathering his courage. "I am thinking about how I cannot imagine my life without you in it anymore. I am thinking about how finding you and Willa was the best thing that ever happened to me. I am thinking about how I want to spend every evening for the rest of my life sitting with you like this." Wendy's breath caught, her hand coming up to press against her heart. "Mason, I think about those things too. Every day I think about how lucky we were that you found us, how lucky I am that you are the kind of man who would give everything to help strangers, how lucky I am that I get to see you every day and talk to you and be near you." Mason stood and crossed to where she leaned against the railing. He took her hands in his, feeling how small and delicate they were compared to his work-roughened ones. "Wendy Lewis, I am falling in love with you. I have been since the moment you opened your eyes and looked at me in the desert. I know it is fast, and I know I do not have much to offer, but I cannot keep pretending I do not feel what I feel." Tears welled in Wendy's eyes, catching the moonlight. "It is not too fast," she whispered. "I have been falling in love with you too. Since you gave us your last meal without a second thought, since you brought us here and made sure we were safe, since every evening when you show up tired and dusty from work but smiling because you are happy to see us. I love you, Mason Hart. I love you so much it scares me." Mason pulled her into his arms and she came willingly, her head fitting perfectly under his chin. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the moonlight, and Mason felt a peace he had not known since before the war. This was right. This was what he had been searching for without knowing it. When Wendy pulled back enough to look up at him, Mason lowered his head and kissed her. Her lips were soft and sweet, and she made a small sound of happiness against his mouth. The kiss was gentle and full of promise, and when they finally broke apart, both were breathless and smiling. "I want to marry you," Mason said, the words coming out before he could think better of them. "I know I should court you properly and wait a respectable amount of time, but I cannot help it. I want you to be my wife, Wendy. I want to build a life with you." "Yes," Wendy said immediately, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you. I do not care about respectable amounts of time. I know what I want, and it is you." They kissed again, longer this time, and when the door opened behind them, they broke apart to find Willa and Mrs. Patterson standing there with matching grins. "About time," Willa said. "I thought you two were never going to figure it out." Mrs. Patterson wiped at her eyes with her apron. "Oh, you young people. This is just wonderful. We need to start planning a wedding." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Mason saved every penny he earned, building up enough money to buy a few things they would need to start their married life. Wendy and Willa sewed a wedding dress from fabric Mrs. Patterson donated, staying up late by lamplight to get it finished. The church ladies rallied around the upcoming wedding, happy to have something joyful to celebrate. The minister agreed to perform the ceremony on a Sunday in late August. Mason worried about Willa, about leaving her alone, but Wendy assured him that her sister would be fine. Mrs. Patterson had grown fond of the girl and had already said she could stay at the boarding house as long as she wanted. Willa herself seemed happy at the prospect of staying in town, having made friends with some of the other young people and finding her place in the community. The wedding day dawned clear and hot, as most days in Arizona did. Mason stood at the front of the small church in his best clothes, which Tom had lent him since Mason did not own a suit. His hands shook slightly as the minister took his place, and then the door at the back of the church opened and Wendy appeared. She was radiant in her white dress, her hair loose and flowing down her back the way Mason loved it. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Willa had gathered that morning, and her eyes never left Mason's face as she walked down the aisle. When she reached him and took his hands, he felt his throat tighten with emotion. The ceremony was simple and beautiful. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and told Mason he could kiss his bride, he did so with all the love and tenderness he felt, holding her close as the small congregation applauded. The celebration afterward was held at the boarding house, with food and drinks and music provided by anyone who could play an instrument. Wendy danced with Mason, her head on his shoulder, swaying to the fiddle music. She danced with Willa, both sisters laughing and spinning. She danced with Tom and with the minister and with every man who asked, but she always came back to Mason, her eyes finding his across the room and lighting up when they did. As evening fell and the party wound down, Mason and Wendy said their goodbyes and rode out to the homestead on Sage. Mason had spent the past week fixing the place up as much as he could, cleaning and repairing and making it as nice as possible for his new bride. It still was not much, but when Wendy stepped inside and looked around, her face glowed with happiness. "It is perfect," she said. "This is our home now, Mason. Our life together starts here." That night, they consummated their marriage with tenderness and passion, learning each other in the lamplight and the shadows. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, Wendy's head on Mason's chest and his arms around her. They talked quietly about their future, about the children they hoped to have, about growing old together in this harsh, beautiful land. "I never thought I would be this happy," Wendy murmured. "When we were dying in the desert, I could not imagine ever feeling safe or loved again. And now I have both, I have everything." "So do I," Mason said, kissing the top of her head. "You saved me too, you know. I was just existing before I found you. Now I am living." The months that followed were the happiest of Mason's life. He continued working at the livery, and Wendy turned their small cabin into a real home. She coaxed the garden into producing vegetables, tended the chickens until they multiplied, and made the single room feel warm and welcoming. They saved money carefully, planning for the future, for the addition they would need to build when children came. Willa visited often, riding out on a horse she had learned to handle with surprising skill. She had started teaching children in town their letters and numbers, having a natural gift for it, and seemed content with her life. She and Wendy remained close, and Mason was glad his wife had not had to choose between marriage and sisterhood. In the spring of 1883, Wendy told Mason she was expecting a child. He whooped with joy and picked her up, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down before she got dizzy. They told Willa the next time she visited, and she cried happy tears and hugged them both. The pregnancy was not easy. The Arizona heat was brutal that summer, and Wendy struggled with sickness and exhaustion. Mason worried constantly, hovering over her until she laughed and shooed him away to his work. But as her belly grew round with their child, She bloomed with a kind of joy that made her more beautiful than ever. Their son was born on a cold November night, arriving fast and healthy with a cry that could wake the dead. Mason cut the cord with shaking hands while Mrs. Patterson, who had come to help with the birth, cleaned the baby and wrapped him in blankets. When she placed the infant in Wendy's arms, both parents stared down at the miracle they had made, tears streaming down their faces. "What should we name him?" Wendy asked softly. "Matthew," Mason said. "After my father, Matthew Hart." "Matthew," Wendy repeated, smiling. "It is perfect." Being a father changed Mason in ways he had not expected. He found himself working even harder, driven by the need to provide for his family. He took on extra jobs when they were available, saved every penny he could spare. He built an addition onto the cabin so Matthew could have his own room as he grew. He bought more chickens and a milk cow. He slowly but surely turned their homestead into a proper working ranch. Wendy was a natural mother, patient and loving and endlessly creative in keeping Matthew entertained and learning. Willa visited even more often once her nephew was born, doting on the baby and helping however she could. The three of them, now four with Matthew, became a family unit stronger than blood alone could make. 2 years after Matthew was born, Wendy gave them a daughter. She had Wendy's blonde hair and Mason's dark eyes, and they named her Margaret after Wendy's mother. Matthew was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to hold her and help take care of her. The cabin was loud and chaotic and full of life, exactly the way Mason had never dared to dream it could be. More years passed in a blur of work and love and watching their children grow. Matthew learned to ride before he could write his own name, sitting in front of Mason on sage and laughing with delight. Margaret toddled after her brother everywhere he went, determined not to be left behind. Wendy taught them both their letters and numbers, instilling in them a love of learning that would serve them well. When Willa announced she was engaged to a shopkeeper named Daniel, who had moved to Wilcox from New Mexico, Wendy cried with happiness. The wedding was held in the same church where Wendy and Mason had been married, and this time it was Wendy standing beside her sister as witness. The joy on Willa's face as she married her love mirrored the joy Wendy had felt on her own wedding day. The two couples remained close, their children growing up together as cousins and best friends. Sunday dinners alternated between the homestead and town, with all of them gathering around whatever table was available to share food and stories and laughter. Mason would sometimes sit back and watch his wife interacting with her sister, both women happy and settled and safe, and marvel at how far they had all come from that terrible day when he had found them dying in the desert. In 1888, Mason surprised Wendy with a trip to the newly opened general store in Wilcox, where he bought her a beautiful china tea set she had been admiring. It was extravagant, more than they could really afford, but he wanted her to have something fine and lovely. She cried when she unwrapped it, throwing her arms around his neck and kissing him in front of half the town. "You spoil me," she said, laughing through her tears. "You deserve to be spoiled," Mason replied. "You work harder than anyone I know and you never complain. If I can give you something that makes you smile like that, then it is worth every penny." Their third child, another son, was born in 1889. They named him Samuel, and he was quieter than his siblings, more thoughtful. He would sit for hours watching his father work, learning through observation in a way that amazed Mason. By the time Samuel was 4, he could help with the animals as well as Matthew had at twice that age. The children grew and the homestead prospered. Mason had become known throughout the territory as an honest man and a skilled horseman. People sought him out for work, and he was able to pick and choose jobs that paid well and kept him close to home. The desperate poverty of those early days was a distant memory, replaced by a comfortable stability that allowed them to not just survive but thrive. In 1895, when Mason was 39 and Wendy 33, they celebrated their 13th wedding anniversary with a party at the homestead. Friends and neighbors came from miles around, filling the property with noise and life. Matthew, now 12, helped his father manage the crowd while Margaret, 10, helped her mother serve food. Samuel, 6, mostly stayed close to his mother's skirts, overwhelmed by all the people. As evening fell and the party wound down, Mason and Wendy found themselves alone on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The sounds of their children playing with the few remaining guests floated on the warm air. Wendy leaned against Mason's shoulder with a contented sigh. "You ever think about that day?" she asked softly. "The day you found us." "All the time," Mason admitted. "I think about how different my life would be if I had ridden a different road that day, if I had been an hour earlier or later. I think about how lucky I am that the timing worked out exactly right." "I used to think we were lucky that you found us," Wendy said. "But now I think you were just as lucky. We needed each other, Mason. We were supposed to find each other." "I believe that," Mason said, pulling her closer. "I believe we were always meant to be together. Everything that happened, good and bad, led us to that moment, and I would go through all of it again if it meant ending up here with you." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead. Mason thought about the boy he had been, joining the cavalry to escape a farm he did not want to run. He thought about the soldier he had become, hardened by violence and loss. He thought about the drifter who had claimed a piece of land and tried to carve out a solitary existence. And he thought about the man he was now, husband and father and friend, surrounded by love and family and purpose. All of it had been worth it to get to this moment. All of it had been leading him to Wendy. Matthew came running up to the porch, his face flushed with excitement. "Pa, can we sleep outside tonight, please? It is such a nice night and Sam really wants to see the stars." Mason looked at Wendy, who smiled and nodded. "All right," he said. "Get your bedrolls and set up by the corral, but you all need to actually sleep, not stay up talking all night." "We will," Matthew promised, already running off to tell his siblings. Mason and Wendy watched as their 3 children dragged blankets and pillows outside, laughing and arguing good-naturedly about the best spot to set up. When they were finally settled, lying on their backs and pointing at constellations, Wendy squeezed Mason's hand. "We did good," she said. "Look at them, Mason. We made those beautiful children. We built this life. We did that together." "We did," Mason agreed, his throat tight with emotion. "And I would not change a single thing." They stayed on the porch long after their children fell asleep under the stars, long after the last guests had departed and the house was quiet. They talked about everything and nothing, the way they had been doing since those first evenings at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. They made plans for the future, dreaming about the ranch continuing to grow, about their children finding their own paths, about growing old together on this land they both loved. When they finally went inside to their own bed, Mason held Wendy close and thought about how his whole life had changed, because he had chosen to ride a particular road on a particular day in July 14 years ago. He thought about how close he had come to missing this, to never knowing what it felt like to love someone so completely and be loved in return. He thought about 2 starving girls under a mesquite tree and about giving them his last meal without hesitation, and about how that single act of kindness had transformed everything. "I love you," he whispered into Wendy's hair. "I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "I love you too," Wendy murmured, already half asleep. My cowboy hero who saved me from the desert, my husband, my heart. Mason closed his eyes and let sleep take him, secure in the knowledge that he would wake up tomorrow with Wendy beside him. And the day after that, and the day after that, and every day for the rest of their lives. They had built something real and lasting from nothing but determination and love. They had taken the worst circumstances and made them into something beautiful. Years continued to pass in the rhythm of seasons and harvests, of children growing and life progressing. Matthew became a skilled rancher in his own right, eventually starting his own spread with his father's help and blessing. Margaret showed a talent for healing and became apprenticed to the doctor in Wilcox, one of the first women in the territory to pursue such a path. Samuel stayed on the homestead, quietly taking over more and more of the daily operations as Mason grew older. Willa and Daniel had 4 children of their own, and the 2 families remained as close as they had always been. Sunday dinners continued to be sacred, with sometimes 20 people crowding around tables pushed together to make room for everyone. Wendy and Willa would look at each other across the chaos of children and food and laughter, and their eyes would meet with understanding and gratitude for the lives they had built from such desperate beginnings. In 1905, Mason and Wendy celebrated their 23rd anniversary by taking a trip to California, finally completing the journey that Wendy's father had started all those years ago. They stood on the beach and watched the Pacific Ocean roll in, and Wendy cried for the father who had never made it this far. Mason held her close and let her grieve, understanding that some wounds never fully healed but could be survived with the right person beside you. When they returned home, they found their homestead being tended by Samuel and his new wife, a girl from town who fit into the family as if she had always been there. The ranch was thriving, the house was full of love, and Mason realized with startling clarity that he had lived a good life. Not just good, but extraordinary in its ordinariness, full of the small daily miracles of family and work and love. One evening in the summer of 1907, Mason and Wendy sat on their porch, now old and worn but still sturdy, watching another sunset. They were in their 50s now, with gray in their hair and lines on their faces earned through years of hard work and laughter. Their children were grown and successful, their grandchildren numerous and delightful. The homestead that had started as a single-room cabin was now a proper ranch house with additions and improvements that told the story of their life together. "You remember what you said to me the night you proposed?" Wendy asked, her hand in Mason's as it had been for 25 years. "I said a lot of things that night," Mason replied with a smile. "You said you wanted to spend every evening for the rest of your life sitting with me," Wendy reminded him. "And you have done exactly that. Every single evening you have been right here beside me." "There is nowhere else I would rather be," Mason said simply. "Then, now, or ever." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to purple to deep blue. Somewhere in the house behind them, they could hear Samuel and his wife preparing dinner. Somewhere in town, Matthew was closing up his own ranch for the day while Margaret finished her rounds with the doctor. Somewhere in the world, their grandchildren were playing and learning and growing into the people they would become. And here on this porch, in this moment, Mason and Wendy were exactly where they belonged. "I am so glad you rode down that road," Wendy said softly. "I am so glad you were the kind of man who would stop to help. I am so glad you gave us everything when you had so little. I am so glad for every single day we have had together." "Me too," Mason said, pulling her close and pressing a kiss to her temple. "Every single day I am grateful. For you, for our children, for this life we built. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Wendy Hart." "And you are mine," Wendy replied, her eyes shining with love. My cowboy who saved me, my husband who loved me, my partner who built this life with me. You are everything good in my world, Mason." They watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky, the same stars they had been watching together for 25 years. They had weathered hardships and celebrated joys. They had raised children and built a legacy. They had loved each other through easy times and difficult ones, never wavering in their commitment to the life they were creating together. And it had all started because Mason Hart had chosen compassion over convenience, had given his last meal to two starving sisters without a second thought, had opened his heart to the possibility of love when it appeared in the most unexpected way. As the night deepened and the stars multiplied overhead, Mason held his wife close and thought about all the roads he had traveled to get to this moment. Every difficult choice, every act of kindness, every moment of courage had led him here. To this porch, to this woman, to this life that was more than he had ever imagined possible. "I love you," he whispered into the gathering darkness, the same words he had been saying for 25 years and would continue saying for as long as he had breath. "I love you too," Wendy replied, her voice warm and certain. "Today, tomorrow, and always." They sat together under the vast Arizona sky, two people who had found each other against impossible odds and built something beautiful from the ashes of despair. They had proven that kindness mattered, that love could transform everything, that the smallest acts of generosity could change the course of entire lives. Their story had started with a cowboy finding two sisters starving on a road in the summer heat. It had continued with him taking them home and feeding them his last meal without hesitation. And it would end, many years from now, with two people who had loved each other completely and built a legacy that would outlive them both. But for tonight, they simply sat together on their porch, hand in hand, heart to heart, exactly where they belonged. The desert wind whispered through the mesquite trees, the horses moved softly in the corral, and somewhere an owl called out into the night. It was an ordinary evening in an extraordinary life, and neither Mason nor Wendy would have changed a single moment of it. This was their happily ever after, earned through hardship and sealed with love. This was their reward for choosing each other, for fighting for their life together, for never giving up even when the odds seemed impossible. This was what happened when a good man made a simple choice to help someone in need, and that choice blossomed into something more beautiful than either of them could have dreamed. As the moon rose full and bright over the Arizona landscape, Mason and Wendy Hart sat together in perfect contentment, surrounded by the life they had built and secure in the love that would carry them through whatever years remained. They had started with nothing but hope and determination, and they had created everything that mattered. And every evening for the rest of their lives, they would sit together like this, watching the sun set on another day of their remarkable ordinary life, grateful beyond measure for the twist of fate that had brought them together and the love that had kept them that way. Their children would remember this image of their parents, always together, always in love, always content in each other's presence. And their grandchildren would hear the story of how it all began, of the cowboy who saved two starving sisters and fell in love with one of them. And they would understand that true love was real and worth waiting for. This was their legacy, written in the lines of their home, in the faces of their descendants, in the very soil of the land they had tended together. This was what mattered in the end, not wealth or fame, but love and family, and the knowledge that you had lived a life that meant something. Mason and Wendy had achieved that and more, and as they sat together under the stars that final evening, neither had any regrets about the choices they had made or the life they had lived together. They had found each other when both needed saving, and they had spent every day since then building something worth saving. That was enough. That was everything.